In this video, we're going to look at a play that has an infield fly, obstruction, followed by an ejection at the end of the whole sequence. So in this video, we'll go through the play, talk about the ruling, what the proper ruling should be, and then we'll look at the ejection report and break down the ejection. To start, let's look at the play. We've got runners on first and second and one out. So the infield pop-up here is going to result in an infield fly called by our plate umpire. We then have to look at the contact between R2 and the third baseman. Now, there's no doubt this is contact. Let's go ahead and look at the definition of obstruction. Rule 2-22-1. Obstruction is an act, intentional or unintentional, as well as physical or verbal, by a fielder, any member of the defensive team, or its team personnel that hinders a runner or changes the pattern of play. When obstruction occurs, the ball becomes dead at the end of playing action, and the umpire has authority to determine which base or bases shall be awarded the runners according to the rule violated. Now, from the definition, what I'd like you to take away is, first of all, obstruction at the high school level is always a delayed dead ball. This is different from the rule at the professional and collegiate levels, where there is type A and type B obstruction, where one of which results in an immediate dead ball and the other is also a delayed dead ball. In high school, we don't have the difference between two different types of obstruction. In high school, it's always going to be a delayed dead ball, and then when you look further down in the definition, you see that the umpire shall award bases as to nullify the obstruction. But we need to go further into the rule book to get more clarity on what we are supposed to award. Rule 8-3-2. When a runner is obstructed while advancing or returning to a base, the umpire shall award the obstructed runner a minimum of one base beyond the runner's position on base when the obstruction occurred. The umpire shall award the obstructed runner, as well as other runners, any additional bases that would nullify the obstruction. So in the high school rules, we're required to give that minimum one base for an obstruction award. So in this scenario, because the obstruction happened to R2 between second base and third base, we would be required by rule to award that runner third base on the obstruction. Now, we actually missed that on the field, and that probably comes from not wanting to overpenalize the defense on a play like this. And the reason it feels like overpenalizing is because at other levels, the award would not be third base. At other levels, we could either ignore the obstruction or just leave the runner at second base. So let's look at the MLB rules. Rule 6.01H. When obstruction occurs, the umpire shall call or signal obstruction. 1. If a play is being made on the obstructed runner, or if the batter runner is obstructed before he touches first base, the ball is dead and all runners shall advance, without liability to be put out, to the bases they would have reached in the umpire's judgment if there had been no obstruction. The obstructed runner shall be awarded at least one base beyond the base he had last legally touched before the obstruction. Any preceding runners forced to advance by the awarded bases as the penalty for obstruction shall advance without liability to be put out. 2. If no play is being made on the obstructed runner, the play shall proceed until no further action is possible. The umpire shall then call time and impose such penalties, if any, as in his judgment will nullify the act of obstruction. Now, going back to our play, we see that when the obstruction occurs, there's not a play actively being made on the runner. The shortstop is trying to catch the infield pop-up, which means our third baseman is not making a play on the ball and not making a play on the runner. So in OBR, this would qualify as type 2. And that's interesting because with type 2 obstruction, we then have the option to put the runners wherever we believe they would have made had the obstruction not occurred. That means on a play like this, we could simply award the runner just back to second, or if we think the runner would not have made it back to second base regardless of the obstruction, then we could stick with the out. My only thing to you would be probably give the benefit of the doubt to the offense considering the mistake was made by the defense. And don't forget that across all rule sets, we can only protect one fielder to be making the play. So on this play, we can only protect the shortstop or the third baseman. And since this ball was hit just a few feet away from the shortstop who ultimately makes the catch, it's pretty much guaranteed that the shortstop is the one that should be protected on this play and not the third baseman. So ultimately, the ruling we made on the NFHS field was incorrect in that we should have awarded the runner third base. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have to go back and retouch second, but ultimately we should have awarded third. This is different from what it would have been in pro rules, where I'm probably giving the benefit of the doubt to the runner and putting them back at second like we did here. As you can imagine, that's going to create a lot of contention with a coach when you get an obstruction call like this and then have to award third. Unfortunately, this is what is set up in the NFHS rules because we don't have the two different types of obstruction. Now, I've talked about the problems with that in previous episodes, but you need to remember it in a scenario like this because ultimately we should have awarded R2 third base. Now, let's review the ejection and the ejection report. I'm going to go with you through the report that I had to fill out, which our association uses as a template for all our members. That said, I know a lot of associations out there don't really have a template for you to use and don't really provide a lot of education. So we'll walk through the template, cover what you need to have in your ejection reports, and give you some general writing and advice for when you're putting one together. To start, every ejection report is going to need some of the basics to help assigners and associations know what game this occurred in. That's going to include things such as the date of the game, the level of the game, who the home team was, who the visiting team was, what the location was, because that's not always going to be the home school. You might be at a neutral site. We'll need to know who the umpires were involved in the ejection. So that's everyone on the field, including their positions and who made the ejection, along with their contact information. And then more information on the individual that was ejected, including their name, their role, their team, and their number. Now, after filling in all those blanks, we then get to the real meat of the ejection report. This is going to be divided into 4 different categories. We're going to have the reason for the ejection, the sequence of events, the behavior after the ejection, and any additional notes. Now, the first thing we fill out is the reason for the ejection. This should usually be fairly short and should tie the ejection to a specific rule that was used to eject the individual. In this situation, it's a sportsmanship violation, and we can tie this directly to a rule. Reason for ejection: violation of NFHS Rule 3-3-1F2. Use of profanity, intimidation tactics, or remarks reflecting unfavorably upon another person. The player, Lloyd Braun, directed the word retarded twice at the calling umpire, Patrick Farber, while also using inappropriate and offensive language. The reason this is important is it gives the reader an immediate understanding of what the ejection is going to be, who's getting ejected, and why it occurred. This helps the reader to know what they're going to be looking for as they read through the sequence of events. Now, in the sequence of events, you can really think of it as 3 different categories. We'll first talk about the play that led up to all of this. Then we'll talk about the interactions between the umpire and the player and coaches. And then finally, we'll cover everything after the player has been ejected. So we start by laying the scene for the reader. In the top of the 5th inning, with 1 out and runners on first and second, Team Improv was on defense. A low pop-up was hit to the shortstop. The runner from second base was stealing on the pitch. The third baseman, Lloyd Braun, who was positioned in front of the base, turned to chase the ball and collide with the runner from second, resulting in obstruction. The shortstop made the catch, and the ball was then thrown to second base in an attempt to double off the runner, who had not yet retouched. I ruled obstruction on the third baseman, who was not the protected fielder since the shortstop was clearly making the play. As a result, the batter was declared out on the catch, and both runners were returned to their original bases. So this will be helpful in your report because it lays out the play that led up to all the confusion and commotion. In this, it was a fairly complicated play and a fairly rare play. So that helps the reader to understand, just by context, oh, this is probably a weird situation that's going to take a lot of explaining from the umpire. So it just lays out some of the context, but again, it's entirely factual. There's no opinions given, just facts. Now we move on to the interactions leading up to the ejection. Following the call, there was confusion from the defense about the ruling. While I was standing on the infield grass near second base, head coach Matt Wilhelm approached. Before he arrived, the third baseman, Lloyd, began to argue the obstruction call with me. As I began to explain the call to Coach Wilhelm, specifically that only one fielder can be protected on a play and that it was the shortstop, Lloyd continued to interject from behind the coach. Coach Wilhelm attempted to de-escalate and remove Lloyd from the discussion. As this occurred, the player stated twice and loudly, "Ends retarded, ends retarded." At that point, the player was immediately ejected for the use of inappropriate and derogatory language. Now, all of this is going to be confirmed when we look at the video, but we don't have any audio from the video. So that's why it's important for umpires to put in quotations when they can. Now, that doesn't mean we need to have quotes for the entire conversation, and we don't need it all verbatim. We need a general understanding of the conversation and what's being discussed. What is important is that when we have an ejection, we want to try to have quotes for why someone was ejected. In this case, it's going to be the remarks by the player, which we have written in the report. It is important that you do write out what was actually said in the report, as this is going to go back to your association, your leadership, and they need to know the quotes. They need to know exactly what was said. So you have to write that out in your ejection report. This is also important because it builds the support for the rule that you ejected for. In this case, it was a violation of sportsmanship using derogatory language, and of course, the 2 words given, very much so. So it's critical that we have those words in our report because those support our ejection. After that, we then give the interactions after the ejection. I informed Coach Wilhelm that Lloyd had been ejected. Coach Wilhelm initially responded, "No, he's not," and claimed that the player was referring to the runner from second base, not me. I explained that regardless of who the comment was directed toward, such language is unacceptable and grounds for ejection. Coach Wilhelm then directed Lloyd to return to the dugout. The player complied and left the field without further incident. Coach Wilhelm briefly continued to question the obstruction ruling until my partner, umpire John Adams, stepped in and informed him that the discussion was over and he needed to return to the dugout, which he did without incident. So in here, you can see I didn't linger on a lot of the conversation I had with the coach about the actual ruling because that's not necessarily relevant to the ejection or the reason that we ejected. I did discuss, though, how the player left the field, which in this situation was pretty calm, and I did allow for them to have the explanation that the coach tried to give around the comments that were made, which, if they were made about the player, still just as inappropriate as about the umpire. So either way, he's going to be ejected, and it really doesn't change the rule that is supported. It then continues to simply say the player left the field without incident. And this section of the ejection report comes to an end when we get to the moment where everyone has left the field that's not supposed to be on it, and play is beginning to resume. After this, we cover the player's behavior after the ejection. This is going to be anything from really when the last sequence ended all the way through you leaving the field at the end of the day. In this scenario, the report reads, the player remained in the dugout for the remainder of the game and for the duration of the second game of the doubleheader. No further issues arose. Now, this scenario, it was pretty easy, but this could be more important in a scenario where you eject a coach and their egregious behavior after ejection could result in them getting a longer suspension or a bigger fine. Finally, we get to additional notes, and this is going to be anything that hasn't been included in the ejection report so far, but might be relevant to the reader. This is also the only spot where you might be able to give your opinion inside an ejection report. When you go back and read everything else, you'll see that everything was fact-based. I didn't exaggerate, I didn't give my opinion on anything. I gave the exact facts that are supported by the video. What we're going to include here is any information that I think might be relevant and needs to be included in the report. For example, the first thing it says is, this was game 1 of a scheduled doubleheader. We need to say that in an ejection report because on a date where they played a doubleheader, the reader needs to know whether or not they were ejected in game 1 or game 2, because if it was game 1, then game 2 would count towards their suspension. There's some other details that might be important there, but that's certainly one of them. Now, let's get into the elephant in the room that the reader needs to know if they don't have the video and don't know me. Obviously, the use of the N-word, very inappropriate. It did come from a black player, and as you can probably tell, I am very white. So, not the way that that word is usually used, which probably adds some context to you, right? Obviously, a black player saying that to a white umpire, very different than a white player saying it to a black umpire. That's context that I thought was important for the reader to know. So I put that in here in the report. It says, regarding the use of the slur in by Lloyd, the player who made the statement is black, as was the runner on second base. I, Patrick, am white. the language used likely reflected the player's everyday vernacular and was probably not intended to be excessively vulgar. It was still inappropriate and in violation of sportsmanship expectations for a high school athletic contest. The use of derogatory language, retarded, is in itself sufficient cause for ejection. So let's think of it this way. If you're the reader of this, you're likely an administrator, either with the umpire association or the school association, and when this comes across your desk, without the context that I just gave, you're probably assuming the worst and that you've got a serious issue here. So in the additional notes, I tried to give some context that helps to explain kind of the situation and the use of something such as this to better give them context of like what it wasn't, right? So I didn't give like my opinion or philosophy or anything like that regarding the word. I just gave them some facts that I thought might be relevant to the reader to help them understand the context of the situation and what penalties might be appropriate. And again, the use of the N-word or retarded, neither of those words is acceptable on the field, and both of them are means for ejection. But again, with these additional notes, that helps the reader understand the vulgarity of how they were used, and then it's up to them how they want to use that information when deciding what the further penalties need to be. So there you have it. That's our review of this wild play and the subsequent ejection report. If you have any thoughts or feedback on it, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the entire ejection, as well as the ruling on the infield fly and obstruction. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our channel and check out our website at umpireclassroom.com. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on the field.